The Economist.
Hello and welcome to The Intelligence from The Economist. I'm your host, Rosie Blore. Every weekday we provide a fresh perspective on the events shaping your world. The US election is so close that the result in a few key states could decide its outcome. As part of our series on these swing states, today we travel deep into Arizona. And you could call her style Jane Austen in Modern Ireland with a dash of S&M. That, at least, is our correspondent's assessment of Sally Rooney, whose new book, Intermezzo, is her richest work yet. But first, this is Golden Week in China, celebrating a special day in a special year. Chinese soldiers raised flags over Tiananmen Square to commemorate the country's National Day when Mao Zedong declared the People's Republic. And this anniversary is particularly special because it marks 75 years of Chinese Communist Party rule, a span that has been marked by extreme repression, iron control, and enormous progress. It's a combination that today's leaders continue to execute all at the same time. But this year's week-long holiday comes amid signs that Xi Jinping is finally wising up to the fact that his country's economy is no longer quite so golden. Central bank officials have unveiled new stimulus plans that have sent the markets upwards. And news has leaked of further easing measures expected soon.
China is belatedly responding to the downturn in its economy with aggressive easing.
Simon Cox is our China economics editor.
Including cuts in interest rates and what looks to be a new fiscal policy that will include help for consumers and help for families, which marks a big shift in thinking for Xi Jinping, who has previously seemed complacent about deflation and reluctant to hand out public money to consumers.
Simon, you say this is somewhat belatedly. Explain the timing. Why is this happening now?
So it's easy to explain why interest rates have been cut, why there's been a monetary response. America's Federal Reserve, America's central bank, cut interest rates, and that has removed some of the pressure on China's own currency. That gives China's central bank a little bit more room to move. The other measures, it's harder to say what exactly has prompted the shift. It's probably accumulation of bad news. In particular, on the local government side, revenues have been coming in short, and as a result, spending has been curtailed. And so this year, in which fiscal policy was supposed to support growth, spending and tax cuts, we've actually had the opposite because of the unforeseen shortfalls in revenue, especially from land and tax revenue. We've actually had a sort of unforeseen, inadvertent fiscal tightening. And that is beginning to really cut through, and social services are beginning to be threatened. And we're also beginning to see some damage to the labour market. And that will prompt the government to act. They can't afford jobs to fail too badly.
Simon, explain to me how big a shift this is for Xi Jinping.
It seems quite big to me, both the style of the stimulus, the form it's likely to take, and also the urgency with which they're tackling these problems, because these problems aren't new. I mean, deflation's been there for 18 months. The property crisis started 3 years ago. And people have been surprised and a bit baffled by the reluctance to act more decisively. I think in the early years, there was a view that some of these problems were contained, localized, transitory. More recently, I think there's just been a fear that it'll be too expensive to deal with these problems, but actually allowing them to fester is more costly than anything else. And the style of stimulus, helping consumers directly, is not something that sits comfortably with a party that sees itself as austere, self-sacrificing in pursuit of larger national goals. And helping people indulge themselves and gratify their consumer desires doesn't fit so neatly with that broader ideological mindset. They would rather be spending this money on 5G towers or fancy facilities for manufacturing.
Okay, let's talk about the specifics. Tell me first of all about this idea of cash payments.
So cash payments is something that reportedly Xi Jinping has been quite resistant to. He doesn't like the idea of just posting checks to consumers for them to spend willy-nilly. There's a strain of fiscal conservatism that runs through China's Communist Party. He also worries that expanding a welfare state too early in China's development will breed laziness and will breed welfare dependency. And what's perhaps most exciting about it is this idea that they would provide handouts, not to everybody, but to families that have 2 or more children, and you would get 1 check per kid above your first. And so this may be one way to disguise a stimulus as achieving a greater national goal of raising China's birth rate and offsetting some of its demographic decline.
It's a fascinating situation where you want to disguise your stimulus. What about the push on the stock market?
Ever since the press conference in which the central bank, flanked by 2 financial regulators, said it would introduce these 2 facilities to help companies buy back their own shares and to help various institutional investors to borrow funds to invest in the stock market, that has been like a starting gun for a remarkable stock market rally. Shares racing upwards both on the mainland and in Hong Kong. This is a slightly sort of peculiar policy choice. Normally you would expect a government to try and support the fundamentals of the economy and to hope that that would then reflect back in the stock market. But here they're really sort of using the tail of the dog to wag the dog. They're stimulating the stock prices immediately in the hope that that will lift confidence and perhaps dispel some of the gloom that's descended on the private sector in China.
And aside from the dizzying rise in stock prices, how successful might this other package of stimulus be?
Again, we don't have anything official yet, but it's certainly along the right lines. So qualitatively in its design, in its priorities, it seems about right. We should be getting more direct help to households. There's a lot of room for additional spending. The old style stimulus in which you just have public investment in infrastructure, that feels played out. There's also an element of this package that will support local governments that are in some quite tight fiscal straits, in particular with very large debts that they're struggling to repay. And that's led them to do things like chasing companies for tax arrears or imposing fees somewhat arbitrarily, all of which has damaged the business environment and had hurt the economy. The problem is, thus far, it doesn't look big enough. Basically, what we've seen is reports that there'll be 1 trillion yuan of bonds issued to help local governments, and there'll be another 1 trillion to help consumers. That adds up to about 1.5% of GDP. We probably need something quite a bit bigger than that. I've seen people talk about packages that would be more like 2 or 3% of GDP over 2 years, something more like 7 trillion rather than 1 or 2 trillion. 7 trillion yuan is about $1 trillion.
Whenever anyone's looking at the Chinese economy, they've also got an eye on the global economy. How much effect might this have beyond China?
So again, it's early days. We don't yet know what impact it'll have on China itself, let alone looking beyond China's borders. But it's in a promising direction. We've already seen a response in commodity prices. So, for example, steel prices jumped after the first round of the package. We've had a lot of complaints from China's trading partners about a flood of cars, electric vehicles, old internal combustion engine cars, a lot of complaints about overcapacity. And some of that reflects rather specific subsidies and industrial policies that China has pursued. But it also reflects just the weakness of China's domestic demand. If China's own consumers are exercising restraint, you have to turn to foreign customers in order to clear your stocks of excess inventory. If China's consumers come out of their shell a little bit, then that will alleviate that problem. And indeed, one of the programs that China is probably going to expand and support is this trade-in program, which is supposed to encourage people to trade in their older electric vehicles or their older internal combustion engine cars for newer, fancier models, or trade in their old consumer appliances for fancier, greener models. There's been talk about buying smart toilets and things like that, all part of this sort of national goal of boosting China's economy and making it a more sophisticated economy at the same time.
Boosting its bottom line. Simon, thank you so much. Great to talk to you.
Angie, thanks very much.
And to hear about a very different side of China, do listen to Drum Tower, our China podcast, which has just aired a 2-part interview with Michael Kovrig, a Canadian former diplomat who was imprisoned by the Chinese government for nearly 3 years. It's an incredible story, told to us for the first time.
The Fox News Decision Desk is calling Arizona for Joe Biden. That is a big get for the Biden campaign. It's also signals.
In 2020, Democrats got a surprise result in Arizona.
Martha McSally there. But Biden picking up Arizona changes the math, and it is the first of the night.
The state, known for its freewheeling libertarianism, voted for Joe Biden for president. Since then, Democrats have also won the governorship and held both Senate seats, a feat not accomplished in Arizona for more than 70 years. Much of that swing came down to the Democratic tilt of Arizona's biggest county, where many Latino voters live. But Democrats may not do as well this time. As part of a series on the swing states that will decide America's presidential election, today we're delving into Arizona and the voters there who could determine whether the state stays blue or switches to red.
Arizona is actually a very recent swing state.
Aaron Braun is our West Coast correspondent.
If we think about 2020, Joe Biden only won Arizona by about 10,000 votes. So that's a really tiny margin. The state only has 11 electoral votes, so it's definitely not one of the kind of heavy hitters like Pennsylvania or Georgia. But if you think about what, for example, Kamala Harris needs to do to win the election, if she didn't win the kind of Rust Belt states of Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, then Arizona could prove incredibly decisive.
So which groups will decide the election in Arizona this time?
Well, Arizona, despite the fact that it now has a Democratic governor and 2 senators, is still quite a Republican state. There are still more registered Republicans than Democrats, and there's a big chunk of independents. Now, there's one region of Arizona in particular that is going to matter more than the rest of the state for electoral purposes, and that is Maricopa County, which includes Phoenix, which is the state capital. It's the biggest city in the state. And more than half of the state's registered voters live in this one county. In 2020, Joe Biden won Maricopa by 45,000 votes, and that is the reason why he won the state. And then there are some groups that will be important in Arizona, like other swing states, female voters and suburban voters. Mormons play an outsized role in Arizona politics as well. But the demographic that will be really interesting to look at this year are Latino voters. Arizona has the highest share of Latino voters among any of the swing states. And Latinos are one of the fastest growing minorities in America. They still prefer Democrats by pretty large margins, but in recent years, Trump has managed to peel off some Latino voters. If you think about 2020, Joe Biden did better than Donald Trump among Latinos, but Trump gained among all kind of sub-demographic groups, especially Latinos without a college degree and younger voters. But what's really interesting about Arizona in particular is that Latinos here are swinging to the right much slower than elsewhere. So had Trump performed among Latino voters in Arizona in 2020 like he did nationally, he would have won the state.
So, Aaron, why are Arizona's Latinos behaving so differently?
Arizona is the only swing state that is also a border state. And being on the border has made it a flashpoint for debates about immigration for decades. And there's 2 really good examples of this from recent political history. The first is that Maricopa County in particular actually was home to Joe Arpaio, and he was, quote unquote, America's toughest sheriff. He ran the county sheriff's office for something like 25 years, and he held these traffic stops that targeted immigrants. He was eventually sued for racial profiling, and more recently, he's been campaigning for Donald Trump. And then you have Senate Bill 1070, which was a law passed in 2010. It required police to ask people they suspected of being an unauthorized immigrant to provide proof of their legal immigration status. Now, Joe Arpaio was voted out in 2016, and part of that law was struck down by the Supreme Court. But one of the ways that Democrats in Arizona were able to convince Latinos to come out and vote for them was by campaigning against this really aggressive approach to immigration enforcement.
And is immigration likely to be such a strong force this time as well amongst Latinos?
Immigration is one of the most important issues in this presidential election, but it's unclear whether this strategy from Democrats will make a difference this time around. So the Economist presidential forecast model has Trump very narrowly ahead in the state, but the race is basically a toss-up. And if you look at recent polling, Kamala Harris is not getting the same level of support among Latino voters that Joe Biden did in 2020. And this could be extremely detrimental to her campaign. Research suggests that conflicted Latino voters, so people who still aren't sure who they're going to vote for, still tend to break for Democrats in the end. But it's been a while since Joe Arpaio has left office and since Senate Bill 1070 has passed. Young voters in particular won't have those political memories, so they won't be voting based on the memories of those policies. And really importantly, Latino voters in Arizona care about a lot more than just immigration. They're voting on the memory of high inflation, on high housing costs in Arizona, on abortion. But if we do stick with immigration policy for a moment, polling of Latino voters in Arizona suggests that they favor both a path to citizenship and securing the border. And in the past, neither major political party really spoke to both of those desires. And we're seeing that change manifestly in the way that Kamala Harris has begun to run her campaign.
So what is Kamala Harris saying that's changing that?
In Arizona last week, Kamala Harris made one of the biggest, if not the biggest, immigration speeches of her campaign so far. And she laid out this really tough on border security stance.
And if someone does not make an asylum request at a legal point of entry and instead crosses our border unlawfully, they will be barred from receiving asylum.
And what's interesting if you think about this speech in an Arizona context is that Democrats in Arizona have been talking tough on the border for years at this point. It really was Joe Biden and Kamala Harris taking cues from them that got them to this tougher stance in the first place.
So we keep hearing about Harris and immigration, but what does this tell us about how it will play in the campaign more broadly?
I think listening to the speech, she knows that immigration is a huge political liability for Democrats. If you think about Donald Trump's first campaign, which he launched in 2015, he manufactured a crisis about the border. But in the past couple of years, he did not need to do that. There really were a record number of migrant encounters at the southern border in 2023. Kamala Harris was tasked with addressing the root causes of migration to Central America in 2021, and Republicans have used this to brand her as Biden's border czar and blame her for the large number of people coming across the southern border. And I think this is one of the reasons why we've seen her go on offense and deliver such a tough speech. This incredible turn that Democrats have taken on border security in the last 18 months or so is really an admission that Donald Trump was winning on the issue. You know, not only is Kamala Harris endorsing the Biden administration's crackdown on asylum, she's saying she agrees with making that crackdown harder to lift. And that's something the administration did this week. It's extremely telling that she made this speech in Arizona, both a crucial swing state and a border state. And it's by no means the last time that we're going to hear Kamala Harris talking about immigration on the campaign trail.
Aaron, it's fascinating stuff. Thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you, Rosie.
And for more on the swing states, this Friday, Checks and Balance, our US politics podcast, will be looking at Pennsylvania. You'll need to be a subscriber to listen.
Even if you've not read any of the books by the Irish author Sally Rooney, it's likely you've heard of her novels.
Andrew Miller writes The Economist's backstory column.
Her debut, Conversations with Friends, was adapted for television in 2022.
I don't want to hurt your marriage. That's all.
My marriage has survived several affairs already.
Oh, ready?
I've just never been party to them.
Her second novel, Normal People, became a TV series a couple of years earlier in 2020.
I've missed you.
Yeah. Yeah, you too.
Intermezzo, Rooney's fourth and latest novel, was published at the end of September. Lots of its themes and motifs will be familiar to her many worldwide fans. Once again, she chronicles the friendships and romances of millennials with a grave moral seriousness and quite a lot of sex. You could call her style Jane Austen in modern Ireland with a dash of S&M. But I think in this book, her best, Rooney has broken free of the creative trap that literary success of the kind she's enjoyed can set. Intermezzo is the story of Ivan and Peter Kubek. Ivan is a 22-year-old socially awkward chess whiz who falls in love with an older woman, Margaret. She's 36, and she's recently escaped from an alcoholic husband. Peter is a decade older than his brother Ivan. He's a barrister and seemingly has all the swagger and success that Ivan lacks. He's devoted to his ex, Sylvia, but he's also having an age gap affair of his own with a young woman called Naomi. Like the characters in Rooney's previous novels, Bobby and Francis from Conversations with Friends, or Connell and Marianne from Normal People, the characters here are highly intelligent and educated, but they struggle to articulate their feelings, and so they wind up causing pain when they really want to be kind and sabotaging their own relationships. People aren't always very nice to the people they love, says Margaret, a line that I think could be the motto of Rooney's entire oeuvre. Again in this book, she captures the swirl of power in relationships and in the course of conversations, beautifully rendering the rhythms and instant regrets of dialogue. Once again, money gets in the way, and her characters long both to be normal, whatever that means, and also to defy convention. But for all these echoes of Rooney's previous work, I think this is her richest book. Two traumas lie at the heart of Intermezzo. One of them is that Sylvia, Peter's ex, has been very badly injured in a car crash. And the other is that the brothers, Peter and Ivan, have recently buried their dad. And grief is a bridge between them, but it's also a chasm. The loss is hard on Ivan because he was very close to his father, and it's hard on Peter because he wasn't. The main difference, though, between this book and its predecessors is that the central bond and tension in it is not romantic but fraternal. I think a lot of readers will recognise the dynamic between the brothers. The older one, Peter, is unable to recognise that little Ivan has grown up, whilst Ivan resents big brother Peter's condescension, but doesn't want to recognise his weaknesses and vulnerability. And the book skillfully conveys that sense of being trapped in childhood roles that actually you've long outgrown. Ivan tells Peter that he hates him, yet they share childhood experiences and memories that only they can grasp. And as a reader, you sympathise with both of them and hope they can find a way to forgive each other. There's another departure from Rooney's previous work. The bits of the book that come from Peter's point of view are written in a kind of staccato stream of consciousness, as if grammar were breaking down under the weight of his depression. Now, this is a technique pioneered by another Irish novelist, James Joyce, a century ago. And in the best bits, it effectively mimics the thoughts and dilemma of a fractured mind. But over long passages, I think it becomes risky, and some readers will appreciate it more than others. Writers who become as famous and successful as Rooney did at a very young age, she's still just 33, face a couple of contradictory pressures. A lot of people want them to do the same thing again, to write books similar to the ones that pleased so many readers before. And at the same time, I think writers have an instinct to do something different and show that they can, and they've got a wider range. This is a challenge which, in Rooney's third book, Beautiful World, Where Are You?, I think she struggled with. And that, to my mind, is the weakest of her 4 books. But now, in this book, Intermezzo, she's kind of found a way out, and that her characters are maturing as she does, and she's exploring new areas of human experience and emotion, whilst at the same time using the techniques in which she's so expert that made her such a success. And every few pages of this book, she pulls off one of fiction's simplest and most magical tricks, which is that as you read her descriptions of passion and heartache or drunkenness or rage, you stop and scratch your head and wonder, how did she know that? Intermezzo, I think, is a wonderful book.
That's it for this episode of The Intelligence. Do let us know what you think of the show. You can get in touch at podcast@economist.com. We'll see you back here tomorrow.